Lords, it's a pleasure to rise to follow the noble Lord Ravensdale, and I thank him for his expression of support for Amendment 7. This is quite a large group of amendments addressing quite a narrow area of the bill, but I think it's very clear that this is crucially important. We're talking about the objectives of the bank. And it's interesting that it has two objectives listed, one of which, clearly looking at the amendments tabled by your lordships, we feel is too narrow, and the other of which is insufficiently clear. So I'm not going to speak at length to the many amendments here addressing both adaptation and biodiversity and the nature crisis and tackling those issues, because I think I feel as a Green I don't really need to, because it's already been so clearly and explicitly said from all sides of the House that it doesn't need to come from me. It's very clear that when we're talking about tackling the climate emergency, we have to tackle the nature crisis. It's a related and equal threat to the security of us all, and it needs to be here on the face of the bill. I think also the noble Lord Teveson's reference to the circular economy is interesting, and indeed I get at this in a different kind of way in terms of demand reduction and resource use reduction in the next group, so I won't go into that in depth now. But I think, as the noble Lord Ravensdale made clear, the second objective, to support regional and local economic growth, that could be local growth in Kensington and Chelsea, or indeed in the Sheffield constituency of Hallam, which has the lowest rate of free school meals, or at least a few years ago it did, of any constituency in the country, when what the government's rhetoric, what the discussion around this bill says, this is supposed to be targeted on the disadvantaged areas, but there is nothing on the face of the bill that says that. And both of our amendments, and indeed the noble, the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of St Albans, also seeks to address. But I will confess that mine also has, by intention, an extra radical element, which is that it takes out the word growth, economic growth. And your Lordship's House will have heard me say before, we can't have infinite growth on a finite planet, and chasing after growth is a problem. But I want to look at what was to, even if we target this on the most disadvantaged areas, certainly they need development, but is it economic growth per se that they need? Who is that growth? Who is that wealth? Who is the advantage from that growth going to? And I come here to quote the Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz, who points out that if our measures, if our measures tell us everything is fine when really it isn't, we will become complacent. In spite of the increases in GDP, in spite of the 2008 crisis being well behind us, everything is not fine. Growth on its own is not going to solve the problem of levelling up, even growth directed to those particular areas. And I think we're seeing considerable moves in parts of government towards recognising this. I note the fact that the Office for National Statistics has a national wellbeing program that has 10 broad dimensions that have been shown to matter to people: the natural environment, personal wellbeing, our relationships, health, what we do, where we live, personal finance, the economy, education and skills and governance. And if we look around the world, the EU Council has defined the economy of wellbeing as putting people and their well-being at the centre of policy and decision-making. And I've referred to before in your Lordship's House, the New Zealand Treasury has produced well-being budgets which operate by guidance under the Living Standards framework. It's about improving people's lives, which is what so many areas of our country desperately need. And indeed, I'd also note that the government last year produced a new system of outcome delivery plans, which do show there are cross-cutting priorities. But I would point, noble lords who want to look into this further, to the report from the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Limits to Growth, which reviewed these and show they still don't go far enough. They're still too focused on growth. So I think it's really crucial that we talk about life outcomes. Now, I chose not to use the word well-being. I'm attempting to be to find a middle ground that the government might be able to agree with here, because I put down life outcomes, which is not the same as well-being. But if we think about some of the things, we think about how some of the areas most to which we might expect most levelling up attention. It's things like the fact that they have a life expectancy 10 years shorter than somewhere wealthy just down the road. It's about the fact that the level of morbidity, the level of ill health of people, I used to live in Somers Town in North London. You just saw on the streets how many people were visibly disabled and ill and suffering in their 30s and 40s. Those are the kind of things that, when I say life outcomes, that's really, I believe, what we should be trying to do. And so if the bank is to invest in forms of infrastructure that actually deliver people a better life outcome, surely that's what it should be doing. So I come now to my second amendment, which is Amendment 16. And this actually addresses some of the points that we've been discussing at some length already about the framework document. Because what this does, this talks about the activities of the bank. And what I've done is rewritten the paragraph to specify that it's not just talking about electricity, but about renewable electricity. And it's not just talking about the provision of heat, but heat from environmentally friendly sources. And what this is intended to do is to come at a way of saying there must be no investment from this bank in fossil fuels. There may be other ways of writing this down. I'm very happy to talk to other noble lords who might be interested similarly. It could be argued that the other amendments talking about first and do no harm do cover this, but I think we explicitly need on the face of the bill no fossil fuels. Now, I suspect the noble lady minister will point me to the explanatory notes, and they note in paragraph 11 on page 5 for anyone interested. It says, as set out in the framework document, the bank will not lend or provide other support to projects involving extraction, production, transportation and refining of crude oil, natural gas or thermal coal, with very limited exceptions. I'm not going to get started on debating exceptions. What I will point to is the last sentence of that paragraph, and noble lords interested in the framework and the status of the framework document, I think really might like to look at this. Because the last sentence says, and I think this says something about the status of the framework document, this policy will be updated over time to reflect changes in government policy and regulatory standards. That suggests the government can just decide to change this any time it likes. As I would read that, without being a legal expert, not even having to table regulations, the government just changes its policies. And that appears to be what it says the framework document is. Now, I feel like I shouldn't really have to do this, but I feel like I do need to make the argument of why we must make sure this bank does not put a penny into fossil fuels. I'll note the letter that the Committee on Climate Change wrote to Kwasi Kwarteng on the 24th of February, which says that it would support a tighter limit on production and a presumption against exploration. It's talking here about fossil fuels. And it says that that would send a clear signal to investors and consumers that the UK is committed to the 1.5 degrees C global temperature goal. And I note that the government often likes to claim to be world leading. Well, there was of course formed at the COP26 climate talks the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, in which France, Sweden and Ireland joined Denmark and Costa Rica, the leaders, in establishing the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, which is pushing for a global treaty on stopping fossil fuel extraction. That's what world leading looks like. And just finally, some figures that I think really drive this home. To be serious about a 1.5 degree target, globally, production of oil and gas must fall by 31% and 28% respectively between now and 2030. But if you combine what are known as the fossil-fuelled five, Australia, the UK, Canada, Norway and the USA, they're set to increase their own oil production, or their increase will take up the global figure by 33% and 27%. So we need a 31% fall and a 28% fall. Instead, we're looking at a 33% rise and a 27% rise. It is really crucial, both in terms of us not putting any money from this bank into fossil fuels, but the signal we send to the world to say nobody should be putting money into fossil fuel exploration.